Have you ever thought that your favorite restaurant, the one you just couldn't imagine giving up, was actually one of the dirtiest restaurants in your city?
I think something just crawled across my ear.
The past 3 months were spent working closely with the Springfield Greene County Health Department to find out who the questionable restaurants are.
This could be anything.
And all health code inspections from August 1st, 2009 to September 1st, 2010 were investigated. What you can't see behind the kitchen doors may be a risk to your health. And in Springfield, there's a lot going on behind the kitchen doors. There's a lot of restaurants breaking the code. During health code inspections, 2 types of violations are given out: critical and non-critical. Sarah Lim is a local health department inspector. She's seen plenty of both in the past 8 years on the job.
A critical violation is a violation that could result in somebody becoming ill. And a non-critical violation is something that would not necessarily result in someone becoming ill, like dirty floors, dirty walls, something like that.
In fact, Springfield ranks second among total restaurant critical violations on a list of Missouri cities including St. Louis, Kansas City, and Columbia, with just under 5,500 offenses. With a total of 870 restaurants, this means Springfield has 6.5 critical violations for every 1 restaurant. And of course, many in the city never receive a single critical violation all year. But the numbers are slightly deceiving. Inspection procedures vary from city to city, which might explain why a certain category of Springfield restaurants continues to struggle. Local health department representatives explained that in St. Louis, for example, inspectors use a grading system, an A, B, or C, depending on how many critical violations a restaurant accumulates.
And that letter is on the outside of the front door. So somebody comes and wants to eat at that restaurant and sees a C, they probably think they didn't do very good on their last inspection. They'll turn around, they won't eat there.
Over the past year, though, it's clear that Springfield restaurants racked up the violations. A search through the Missouri Food Code book helped translate the numbers and decimal points into a top 5 list of problems. Not all items on the list are critical violations, including number 1, but one of them is one of the most dangerous violations possible.
Temperature abuse and bare hand contact are the biggest vehicles in making somebody sick.
In the past year, the health department had 22 verified complaints of food poisoning. If you do feel sick after eating, know the warning signs. According to the Centers for Disease Control, some of the symptoms of common foodborne illnesses include fever, diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and vomiting. Knowing what to look for can save your life.
You know, foodborne illness is responsible for around 5,000 deaths annually and 350,000 hospitalizations every year. So it's a big deal. It's not, you know, and a lot of people probably get sick and have foodborne illness and don't necessarily know it because they don't go to the hospital or they don't make that connection.
One reason for Springfield's high number of critical violations may be because it has a surprisingly high number of restaurants.
This is where Cashew Chicken started. People feel that if they bring a restaurant into Springfield and it does well, then they can go anywhere.
Partly due to the cashew chicken boom of the 1960s, health department officials say Springfield is a melting pot for ethnic restaurants, from Asian to Indian to Mexican cuisine. But they also note these are the same restaurants that struggle the most on their inspections.
We're working with the ethnic community out there to help, because that's where our problems lie, is it's a communication barrier.
That communication barrier stems from the fact that many of these ethnic workers speak English only as a second language. I saw the problems this can cause firsthand while joining local inspector Sarah Lim on a routine inspection of Lotus Chinese restaurant on West Bypass.
It's a cockroach right there. There's another one back here too. Cockroaches carry salmonella. They carry all kinds of diseases that can be passed on humans through food. Those are babies, baby roaches right there, which means that they're breeding in here. So the fact that we're seeing as many as we're seeing, which is quite a few, means that they have a real bad problem.
The presence of insects or rodents in the kitchen is considered one of the most severe health code violations.
We don't know how to get rid of them.
As you can imagine, the results didn't turn out so well for the restaurant.
She wants me to go ahead and pull your guys' permit and close you guys.
Not really.
Yeah, because they're bad and it's been a problem before.
But Lotus is not alone in their struggles.
You want to check to see that, it's clean.
Within the last year, 4 out of the 6 restaurants that had their permits temporarily suspended were ethnic. Additionally, a search of the health department's inspection database revealed 68 repeat offenders where 3 or more critical violations were found. 14 of the top 27 were ethnic restaurants, but one ethnicity in particular has the eye of the health department.
We have more Koreans working in our Chinese restaurants than anybody.
Sok-Ju Kwon is a Missouri State professor of food service and a registered dietitian. A native of Korea herself, she understands the challenges that many of these ethnic workers face.
I have some folks I know owns the restaurant. Some follows the food code really well. Another part, they don't even care. And they always say, I don't even understand what they're saying.
After multiple conversations with the health department in Kwon, it appears the problems boil down to cultural gaps between America and the countries these ethnic workers immigrated from. Sometimes it's verbal.
Sometimes they cannot understand 80% of what you're saying.
Sometimes it's a numbers mix-up.
We use Celsius, but American people use Fahrenheit, and we also use centimeter. Here we use inches and feet.
Sometimes it's just a difference in lifestyles. What may be standard practice there just isn't acceptable here.
So if you have a Vietnamese person who comes in, they're not used to shelter or running water, or they don't care about pests rolling around, they just make the food and get it out.
Lotus had their permit reinstated a day and a half later, and is already showing significant improvements, like most ethnic restaurants with occasional problems do. But one ethnic restaurant in town never made those improvements. That restaurant was Jade Dynasty. No longer in business, it was Springfield's most severe violator within the past year. It led all restaurants with 28 critical violations. It was also the #1 repeat offender. 6 different inspections it had 4 more critical violations, and it was infamous at the health department for breaking a familiar and dangerous code.
Temperature abuse. It was either a refrigerator out of temperature and they weren't paying attention, so we had to throw away food. They have a buffet. So if they weren't monitoring the buffet, if it was out of temperature and they weren't monitoring it, how long it could sit on the buffet.
The restaurant had 10 inspections within the past year. Not once did they ever not receive a violation. But since opening in 2005, Jade Dynasty's most consistent problem had nothing to do with food.
The one thing with Jade Dynasty, believe it or not, it is the same people who own it through this whole time. The problem is the people who do own it, who's managing the program. A lot of times that's where we have problems. And you can educate them one time, and you can go back and see them 2 weeks later, and then 3 weeks later, and a month later. You may have all different people. So then you got to re-educate them again.
Along with Hong Kong Garden, Jade Dynasty also had the most customer complaints at 7. One of those came from Grace Yunkins.
The pudding was sour. The Mongolian barbecue that they have there, the chicken on there was sour. There was flies around there. I would say 10% of the food was edible. I wouldn't even feed that to my dog.
It was May 25th when Yunkins issued her complaint to the health department. 2 days later, inspectors showed up at Jade Dynasty, issuing 7 critical violations and suspending its permit for 7 days. The restaurant never reopened.
The fact that we felt sick afterwards was definitely a negative. We did feel sick. I had a stomach ache, diarrhea.
The owners of Jade Dynasty declined to return multiple phone calls about their inclusion in this story. But even when ethnic restaurants appear to close, health department officials say there are ways around the system. Is it common for restaurants that get shut down to reopen just under a new name?
Mm-hmm.
How do they get away with that?
Well, because that way that the restaurant persona shows that they're under new management and new owners, so that it's going to be somebody new and it's going to be better. And that's how there's people that have changed their names 4 times, and it's the same owners. And then they put that new name up there, and people think, oh, good, it's something different.
But it's not.
But it's not.
You do generally see a lot of times restaurants changing hands within a family.
Not all restaurants that struggle in Springfield are ethnic. The other name at the top of the list is an American restaurant.
Welcome to Ziggy's Cafe! Ziggy's!
The 5 Ziggy's in town combined for 75 critical violations and 8 complaints in the past year alone. 2 locations had their permits temporarily suspended. Just this month, the 3rd Ziggy's on South Glenstone had its permit pulled. And when ranking restaurants that had the most critical violations, 3 of the top 6 were Ziggy's cafes. Like Jade Dynasty, their problems start at the top.
They have a lot of change of management. So if we inspect them and we educate them, we're educating the employees and we're educating the manager. Well, then now, the next time we go back, it's a different manager. Really what makes or breaks a restaurant is management. If that management pays attention and follows through with what they're supposed to do on food safety policies, that we help educate them, then they'll do well.
Even in their advertisements, critical violations like bare hand contact are shown multiple times, one of the most dangerous to customers. An employee at the Ziggy's on South Glenstone was actually cited for smoking in the kitchen. After initially agreeing to an interview to discuss these issues, Ziggy's representatives never returned subsequent phone calls.
See that?
What'd you say?
That's all old soft serve mix that's leaked down in there.
So what can be done to help restaurants like Lotus, Ziggy's, and many others that struggle turn the corner? For health department officials, the solution seems to be mutual. It starts with inspectors like Sarah Lim, who work with restaurant employees on site.
Education is key. I mean, I educate.
And it continues with health educators like Rebecca Ray, who helps coordinate one of the health department's 2 long-term educational strategies for restaurant improvement.
Every month we have a 2-hour food school class where people can sign up. Anyone can sign up, and we do a PowerPoint presentation where we talk about all the different components of safe food handling to make sure that people, food handlers know what's acceptable and what's not.
The health department is also starting a food school for Koreans because they tend to struggle the most. The food school will be a partnership with Missouri State Food Service professor Sok-Ju Kwon.
Providing their own language food school may help them understand better in practice, so they can educate their employees who doesn't even know how to speak English. They can train them in a proper way.
Each path has its obstacles. The Korean food school likely won't begin for another 6 months, and according to Rebecca Ray, monthly food school numbers are steadily declining.
You know, I do think that is very challenging. If we knew the answer to how to fix all of those problems, we wouldn't necessarily have to inspect our restaurants as often as we did.
But there are restaurants the health department doesn't need to inspect as often.
These are hard to clean because you got to get into little holes, but they're cleaning these regularly, or else there would be all kinds of things growing in here.
2 categories tend to perform the best on their inspections in Springfield: high-end restaurants like Flame Steakhouse and chains like Subway that aren't just inspected by the local health department.
We have corporate inspectors that kind of watch us the entire time. You know, we get them regular visits monthly. Just the threat of him coming in at any point in time keeps us on our toes. And City of Springfield, generally, she comes in, we don't have to see her for another 6 months. There's not really that lingering threat, that lingering fear.
But the biggest difference between restaurants that perform well and those that don't seems to boil down to an area lacking at both J Dynasty and Ziggy's: organized management.
You got to make the fundamentals a part of the day-to-day. You know, and that comes initially with training and leadership. You know, if the person who's running the store understands everything and they're able, you know, they're well trained and they're able to communicate that and make that a part of the day-to-day, everything is going to run smoothly.
And that's exactly what the city of Springfield is trying to do: get things behind the kitchen doors to run smoothly. After 3 months of talking to people within the health department, managers and employees of restaurants, and sorting through mounds of inspection and complaint data, it's evident the city has a large amount of health code violations to correct, particularly in ethnic restaurants. But they also are taking steps to solve these problems with on-site education and monthly food school classes.
You just have to be really careful when people come in and service your restaurant.
If you'd like to see some of these steps in action, you can find a food school schedule for 2011 at the health department's website. And if you're ever curious about how your favorite restaurants are performing, the ones you just couldn't imagine giving up, visit the health department's online database, where you can find exactly what's going on behind the kitchen doors and who's breaking the code.